September 21, 1945, Camp Deming, New Mexico. The recreation hall was dark except for the unsteady light of a film projector. Around 500 German prisoners sat crowded together, watching a Western. They laughed loudly at the cowboys chasing down bandits on the screen. But one man, Georg Gaertner, wasn't watching the movie at all. His eyes were fixed on the clock, carefully tracking the time as the minutes slipped closer to 8:47 p.m. The exact moment when a westbound freight train would slow down to take a sharp curve just beyond the fence that marked the edge of the camp. For 3 weeks, Gaertner had memorized the schedule of that train, preparing his plan with the same precision he once used in the army. Tonight, while his fellow prisoners distracted themselves with Hollywood, he intended to attempt something. Very few dared. Out of 425,871 Axis prisoners held in the United States, only 2,221 had ever tried to escape. Now, it was his turn. But unlike those who ran away out of longing for home or a desire to rejoin the war, Gaertner's reason was far more haunting. He wasn't escaping captivity, he was escaping the thought of being sent back. In his pocket was a carefully folded letter, delivered to him 6 weeks earlier by the International Red Cross. That message carried devastating news. His hometown of Schweidnitz in Lower Silesia was no longer part of Germany. The Soviets had handed the region over to Poland, and the German people living there were now facing expulsion, imprisonment, or even worse. For prisoners whose homes had fallen behind the Iron Curtain, America's wealth and safety didn't just feel impressive, it meant survival itself. The sound of gunfire from the film covered the noise of his movements as Gaertner quietly slipped out of the hall. He crawled beneath 2 fences, his heart pounding with every step. In the distance, the whistle of the approaching train cut through the night. He had just 90 seconds to dash across 200 yards of open desert, catch the moving freight cars, and vanish into a country he had grown to love more than the homeland that no longer existed. The path that led Georg Gaertner to that desperate night began on December 18, 1920 in Schweidnitz, a prosperous textile town in the shadow of the Sudeten Mountains. His father worked as the manager of a local brewery, giving the family a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, something that would seem like impossible luxury by the end of the war. As a student, young Georg had a talent for languages. At the Der Gymnasium, he mastered English and French, skills that would later prove far more valuable than any weapon or military training. But when war broke out in September 1939, the 19-year-old Gaertner enlisted in the Wehrmacht, swept up in the national pride and propaganda promising that Germany would rise again. He was assigned to the 10th Panzer Division, where he took part in the rapid victories across France in 1940. Racing through the Ardennes and reaching the English Channel in just 6 weeks, these early campaigns seemed to confirm everything Nazi propaganda said about German strength and Allied weakness. By February 1941, Gaertner was on a transport ship bound for Tripoli, Libya, where he joined Erwin Rommel's newly formed Deutsches Afrika Korps. But North Africa would destroy any illusions of German invincibility. At first, the Afrika Korps consisted of only 2 divisions, yet they were forced to face the massive resources of the entire British Empire. In the North African desert, German soldiers often survived on just 1 liter of water a day under 120-degree heat. Yet when they captured British supply depots, they were stunned to find crates of canned peaches, chocolate, cigarettes, and rum, luxuries that highlighted just how much more their enemies had in resources. The reality of desert warfare was simple mathematics, and no amount of propaganda could hide it. A single Tiger tank needed 600 L of fuel just to move 100 kilometers. By comparison, the entire fuel supply given to the Afrika Korps in March 1942 would have kept General Patton's Third Army moving for only 3 days. German troops joked grimly that Rommel's brilliance as a commander came down to winning battles with equipment patched together by wire and sheer determination. During this time, Georg Gaertner earned a promotion to sergeant in the 164th Light Africa Division. He led a reconnaissance unit tasked with scouting British positions before major attacks, including the famous battle at El Alamein in October 1942. From his position, he and his men could only watch as General Montgomery's forces opened the fight with an artillery barrage of 1,000 guns, more firepower than the entire Afrika Korps had at its disposal. In that opening strike alone, the British fired 15,000 shells. By contrast, German artillery crews were rationed to only 10 shells per gun per day. The retreat from El Alamein turned into a 1,400-mile march of exhaustion and defeat across North Africa. Gaertner's unit abandoned vehicles when fuel ran out, destroyed equipment they couldn't take with them, and saw the Luftwaffe vanish from the skies as Allied air power took complete control. By January 1943, the Afrika Korps was trapped in Tunisia, squeezed into a shrinking pocket as American forces closed in after the landings of Operation Torch. In May 1943, Gaertner's war came to an end in an olive grove outside Tunis. His reconnaissance unit, once 120 men strong, was down to just 17 survivors with no fuel, no ammunition, and no hope. Surrounded by British troops of the 8th Army, he tied a white undershirt to a rifle and surrendered. The British soldiers didn't gloat. In fact, they seemed embarrassed by the scene. They offered their starving prisoners cigarettes and chocolate. To them, the Afrika Korps, once feared, looked more like scarecrows than soldiers. At a temporary prison camp near Matur, Gaertner saw American efficiency at a level that shocked him. Within just 48 hours, the U.S. Army had built a massive tent city for 30,000 prisoners. It had field hospitals, kitchens, and latrines. Every prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, and issued identification tags with precise organization. But the deepest shock wasn't the camp itself. It was the food. After months of surviving on hard biscuits and sardines, the prisoners were handed American sea rations. To U.S. soldiers, these meals were nothing special. But to the Germans, they were like banquets: canned beef, crackers, chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes. Gaertner couldn't believe his eyes when he saw American guards casually tossing aside half-eaten rations, food that would have kept his unit alive for days. When Gaertner pointed out the waste of food to one of the guards, the young American soldier from Iowa just shrugged. "Don't worry, Fritz," he said casually. "We've got plenty more where that came from." The Liberty ship that carried Gaertner across the Atlantic, the USS Samuel Huntington, was itself proof of America's unmatched industrial power. Built at the California Shipbuilding Corporation in Wilmington in only 44 days, it was one of 2,010 identical ships produced by the United States during the war. On board, the ship's mess hall served food unlike anything Gaertner had seen in years. Fresh bread baked every day, powdered eggs that actually tasted like real eggs, and coffee so plentiful that sailors poured leftover pots straight over the bow side. During the 14-day voyage in July 1943, Gaertner's strong English made him useful to the crew, and he was assigned to assist with prisoner administration. The job gave him access to areas most prisoners never saw, including the ship's bridge, where he first laid eyes on radar equipment capable of tracking ships beyond the horizon, technology that Germany had only just begun experimenting with. In the medical bay, he found supplies German field hospitals hadn't seen since 1941, including a new miracle drug called penicillin, which the Americans handed out as casually as aspirin. What struck Gaertner most, however, was not just the abundance but the attitude of the American crew. They treated wealth and resources with shocking casualness. Sailors tossed magazines after reading them once, discarded shoes that were barely worn, and gambled away monthly paychecks larger than what German officers earned in an entire year. When Gaertner asked an able seaman about such waste, the sailor laughed. "Hell, Sarge," he replied. "America makes more in a day than we can throw away in a month." On July 24, 1943, the Samuel Huntington reached Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia. As the ship entered Hampton Roads, Gaertner counted 47 cargo vessels, 12 destroyers, and 3 aircraft carriers in different stages of construction and repair. The shipyards at Newport News stretched for 3 miles along the James River, their giant cranes working nonstop under the glare of electric lights. The prisoners were marched past vast parking lots filled with hundreds of privately owned cars, vehicles belonging to shipyard workers. In Germany, car ownership was still a dream reserved for party elites, yet here, ordinary welders and riveters drove themselves to work. Signs posted around the yard advertised wages that seemed unbelievable to German prisoners. Skilled American. Workers could earn $120 per hour, while back home German laborers made perhaps 50 Reichsmarks in an entire month. But the greatest shock came when Gaertner and the other prisoners boarded the train that would carry them inland. Instead of cattle cars, the kind German soldiers were used to when being transported, they were loaded into real Pullman coaches. The cars had cushioned seats, overhead luggage racks, and electric fans. In the dining car, hot meals were served on actual plates with proper metal cutlery. The treatment was better than what German officers received on their own troop trains. The coaches were even air-conditioned, keeping them cool in the sweltering July heat. Back in Germany, such comfort was reserved only for Hitler's personal train. As the train rolled through Virginia's Tidewater region, Gaertner pressed his face to the window, staring at the countryside and towns outside. What he saw contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had told him. This America was real, and it was nothing like the enemy his leaders had described. Every small town they passed glowed with electric lights, even at 10 p.m. In Martinsville, the main street shone brightly, with shop windows filled with merchandise on display. At Roanoke's rail yards, huge banks of floodlights made the night look like daylight. Back in Germany, strict blackout rules had kept cities in darkness since 1940. Here, light was so plentiful that it seemed to be wasted. When the train stopped in Charlottesville to take on water and coal, the prisoners witnessed American efficiency firsthand. Automated coal loaders filled the locomotive's tender in just 20 minutes, a job that would have taken 2 hours of hard labor in Germany. The railroad workers wore sturdy leather boots and denim overalls, clothing that in Germany would have cost 3 months of a worker's wages. They drank Coca-Cola straight from glass bottles, then tossed the empties into recycling bins, discarding items that would have been prized possessions during wartime in Europe. As the train crossed into Tennessee, the scale of American industry left the prisoners speechless. Near Kingsport, they saw the massive Tennessee Eastman Chemical Complex, with cooling towers and distillation columns stretching for 2 miles. Rolling through Kentucky's coal country, their train ran alongside endless freight trains hauling coal out of the Appalachian mines. Gaertner counted 147 cars in one coal train alone, each car loaded with 100 tons and pulled by locomotives larger than anything he had ever seen in Europe. Near Louisville, they passed the enormous Rubber Town complex, where 4 synthetic rubber plants had risen from empty farmland in just 18 months. Together, these facilities produced 800,000 tons a year using methods first developed by German scientists, but never expanded to such scale back home. At its peak, Germany had managed only about 120,000 tons annually. The psychological weight of what they were seeing grew heavier with every mile westward. In St. Louis, the train crossed the Mississippi River. Below them, barges carried loads of grain larger than Germany's entire harvest of 1942. Along the riverfront, rail yards stretched for 8 miles, lined with grain elevators that held enough wheat to feed the city of Munich for 5 years. Moving into Missouri's farmland, the view was endless fields of corn stretching beyond sight. Every farmhouse had electric power, running water, and at least one automobile parked outside. Farmers worked massive combines that cost more than Gaertner's father had earned over his entire life. And yet these people were not party officials or members of the elite. They were ordinary citizens. After 4 days of witnessing such abundance, the train reached Camp Hearne, Texas on July 28, 1943. The camp had been built in only 4 months on 840 acres just outside the town of Hearne. It was designed to hold up to 4,800 German prisoners, and its conditions were better than what many of them had known as civilians. The wooden barracks had electricity, flush toilets, and hot showers, luxuries compared to the field conditions of the Wehrmacht. The camp's daily rations drove the point home even further. Each prisoner received between 3,000 and 3,600 calories every day, a level of food supply that seemed almost cruel to men who knew their families back home were starving. Meat, vegetables, bread, butter, milk, and coffee were provided in amounts that German civilians back home, barely surviving on 1,000 to 1,250 calories per day, would not experience until 1948. In fact, the kitchen crews at Camp Hearne threw away more food each day than entire German villages consumed. Gaertner was assigned to the camp's administrative section, where his strong English skills quickly became valuable. This position gave him a close look at American logistics, and what he saw stunned him. Each week, Camp Hearne received $40,000 lb of beef, 20,000 loaves of bread, 15,000 gallons of milk, and tons of fresh vegetables. With surplus materials that Americans considered little more than scrap, the prisoners built facilities that seemed unimaginable in wartime Germany. They constructed an amphitheater with seating for 30,000 people for plays and concerts, sports complexes complete with soccer fields and swimming pools, and even decorative fountains made from concrete and lumber that would have been priceless back home. By September 1943, America's labor shortages led to the use of POWs in agriculture and industry. Gaertner's work detail was sent to local cotton farms, traveling daily through the Texas countryside without blindfolds or restrictions on their routes. The first farm belonged to Jim Morrison, who owned 2,000 acres outside Hearne. Morrison greeted the prisoners in denim overalls, driving a Ford truck that cost more than a German worker could earn in a lifetime. His farm had 2 tractors, a combine harvester, and mechanical cotton pickers, machines that replaced dozens of field workers. When Gaertner expressed his amazement, Morrison chuckled. "Hell, Sergeant, I'm just a small farmer. You should see the big operations in California." Even black and Mexican field workers, who occupied the lowest rungs of America's social order, enjoyed meals and comforts that were unimaginable in Germany. Their lunches were thick sandwiches filled with meat and cheese, fresh fruit, and thermoses of iced tea. They wore strong boots and cotton clothing, owned radios and bicycles, and some even had automobiles. When Gaertner remarked that such comfort seemed impossible during wartime, a black foreman named Samuel Washington answered plainly, "This ain't prosperity, Sergeant. This is just regular times. You should have seen the 20s. At a cotton gin outside Calvert, Gaertner witnessed mechanical processing that completely surpassed German agricultural methods. A single gin there could handle more cotton in one day than his entire home province could process in a month. The gin ran on electricity supplied by the Rural Electrification Administration, a New Deal program that had already brought power to 90% of Texas farms. Nothing, however, broke Nazi racial ideology more deeply than what happened at Christmas in 1943. American churches, civic groups, and families donated 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs, the same men who had been fighting against American soldiers only months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, soap, razors, playing cards, and hand-knitted socks. At Camp Hearne, the local Methodist and Baptist churches even organized a joint Christmas service conducted entirely in German. The Christmas service at Camp Hearne was unlike anything the prisoners had ever imagined. A choir made up of Texas housewives whose own sons and husbands were serving overseas sang Stille Nacht and O Tannenbaum, while many German prisoners broke down in tears. Local Sunday school children had made hand-drawn cards with simple messages such as "Jesus loves you" and "Merry Christmas, Fritz." The holiday meal itself stunned the men who knew their families back home faced hunger and food shortages. The tables were filled with turkey, ham, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, and even ice cream. The amount of food served could have fed a German battalion for an entire week. The mess halls were decorated with electric lights, shiny tinsel, and real Christmas trees. That same day, Gaertner helped distribute mail, including Red Cross packages from Germany. Those letters showed just how desperate life had become back home. Families wrote on scraps of paper, sealed envelopes made from newspapers, and used stamps, showing Hitler's face now drawn with more visible fatigue. The difference was impossible to miss when compared with American Christmas cards, thick, brightly printed, and cheerful, reflecting two nations living very different realities. By spring of 1944, more than 15,000 German POWs across Texas were enrolled in education programs. The U.S. Army, working with American universities, offered correspondence courses, lectures, and vocational training. The University of Texas even sent professors to Camp Hearne to teach subjects like American history, economics, and government. Among these teachers were Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution. They taught without bitterness or propaganda. One of them, Professor Ernst Goldsmith, who had escaped from Heidelberg in 1938, gave lessons in constitutional law to Wehrmacht officers who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler. Many prisoners were shocked by his fairness and lack of vindictiveness, having expected harshness instead. The camp's library contained 20,000 books in both German and English, along with subscriptions to major American newspapers and magazines. Prisoners could read the New York Times, Time Life, and the Saturday Evening Post, gaining access to multiple perspectives on world events, something impossible in Nazi Germany, where every publication followed the party line. Vocational training prepared prisoners for life after the war, with equipment German trade schools could only dream of. In the auto mechanics shop, they worked on real engines, studied electrical systems, and trained with diagnostic tools that were far ahead of what was available in German technical colleges. Gaertner chose to study accounting, learning directly about American business practices. His textbooks explained how corporations functioned, how stocks and bonds operated, and how ordinary citizens could invest and build wealth, concepts that Nazi propaganda had always distorted. By the summer of 1944, POW labor programs expanded further as American industrial production hit record levels. Gaertner's crew was sent to work at a small oil refinery outside Houston. There, he saw petroleum processing on a massive scale, which made clear why German tanks constantly ran out of fuel, while American forces never did. The refinery processed 100,000 barrels of oil each day, more than the entire output of Romania's Ploiești oil fields, which Germany struggled to defend. The refinery employed 5,000 workers across 3 shifts, and among them were hundreds of women operating complicated machinery. These Rosie the Riveters earned wages higher than what many German factory managers made, drove their own cars to work, and wore clothing that would have been impossible to obtain under Germany's strict rationing system. At the San Jacinto Ordnance Depot, Gaertner and other prisoners were assigned to unload endless shipments of ammunition. What they saw left them stunned. One single daily shipment contained more artillery shells than an entire German division would fire in a month. The scale of American production was beyond anything they had imagined. The Houston ship channel added to the shock. Each day it handled more cargo than Hamburg, Germany's largest port, had managed in an entire week before the war. Even more demoralizing was America's attitude toward waste. Materials that Germans considered precious strategic resources were tossed aside without hesitation. Empty oil drums were abandoned rather than cleaned and reused. Broken machinery was scrapped instead of repaired. To the prisoners, it was proof that American industry was so vast that efficiency no longer even mattered. Meanwhile, letters from home painted a picture of Germany's collapse. Gaertner's mother wrote on scraps of old ledger paper with pencil, because ink was no longer available. She described surviving on starvation rations while his father's brewery had already been destroyed by Allied bombing. On June 6, 1944, news of the D-Day landings reached the camp. Guards excitedly shared newspaper extras describing the invasion: 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in just the first wave. The sheer scale made it clear to the prisoners that German resistance had no chance of succeeding. By the autumn of 1944, even the most committed Nazis inside the camps had grown silent. Letters arriving from home spoke of cities without electricity or running water. Old men and young boys were being drafted into the Volkssturm for desperate, hopeless fighting. Then came April 1945. The U.S. Army forced all POWs to watch films taken inside newly liberated concentration camps. At first, many refused to believe what they were seeing, but the evidence was undeniable. Hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps wept openly as they realized the full scale of what their regime had done. They had been fighting for a government responsible for unimaginable atrocities, all while they themselves were living in American camps eating better than civilians in Germany. The camp hospital recorded a 400% rise in psychiatric cases in the weeks after the screenings. Victory in Europe came on May 8, 1945. For Americans, it was a time of celebration. But for prisoners like Gaertner, it brought only fear. Germany, had surrendered unconditionally, and maps showed his hometown in Silesia now under Soviet control. Its German population faced expulsion, imprisonment, or worse. That summer, preparations began for repatriation. Instead of joy, the news filled thousands of prisoners with dread. The U.S. government announced that all POWs would be sent back to their exact places of origin, regardless of who now controlled those lands. For the 35,000 Germans whose homes were now under Soviet or Polish authority, this was essentially a death sentence, or a one-way journey to Siberia. Rumors spread quickly about Operation Keelhaul, the forced return of Soviet citizens who had fought alongside Germany. Prisoners learned that American and British troops had beaten and forced screaming men onto ships bound for the Soviet Union, where they faced either execution or a lifetime in the Gulag. Letters from prisoners who had already been repatriated confirmed the darkest fears. Those sent back into the Soviet zone were immediately screened by the NKVD. Former POWs were viewed as tainted by Western influence and suspected of working as American spies. Many vanished into forced labor, camps in the Urals or Siberia never to be seen again. For Georg Gaertner, the decision to escape became final in August 1945. That month he received official word that Świdnica, his hometown, had been handed over to Polish administration. The entire German population there faced expulsion and persecution. Because of his role in camp administration, Gaertner had access to schedules and paperwork most prisoners never saw. He discovered that his group was slated for transfer in October, first to Fort Eustis, Virginia, then onto a Liberty ship bound for Bremerhaven, and finally, by train into Silesia, straight into Soviet or Polish control. Determined to avoid that fate, he began planning an escape with military precision. He studied guard routines, memorized nearby train timetables, and quietly saved his prisoner wages, 80 cents a day, exchangeable for cash. He also practiced speaking English with a convincing accent, building a cover story as Peter Peterson, a Norwegian immigrant who had lost his identification papers. On September 21, 1945, everything fell into place. That night, the Western film San Antonio was being shown at the camp, drawing most prisoners and guards into the recreation hall. A new moon meant the night sky was pitch black. By then, Gaertner had saved $25, enough to survive at least for a short while. At 8:30 p.m., as gunfire echoed from the movie screen, Gaertner slipped quietly out the back exit of the recreation hall. Keeping low, he crossed to the inner fence within 90 seconds. After confirming that no patrols were nearby, he crawled under the outer fence and sprinted across the desert scrub. Moments later, the sound of a freight train grew louder. As the headlight appeared around the curve, he realized it was moving faster than he had expected. Running alongside the tracks, he timed his leap as the locomotive thundered past. With all his strength, he grabbed onto the ladder of a boxcar and pulled himself aboard while the train rumbled along at 15 mph. Exhausted, he collapsed inside the empty car, straining to hear any alarms or sirens. None came. By the time the evening roll call took place at 10 p.m., the train had already carried him 30 miles away, heading west toward El Paso and freedom. When dawn broke on September 22nd, the freight train rolled into El Paso, where Gaertner slipped off and made his way to the local YMCA. There he rented a room for 50 cents. The desk clerk, a war veteran missing his left arm, looked him over carefully but said nothing. Inside the YMCA reading room, Gaertner picked up the morning newspapers and saw the scale of the manhunt unfolding. The El Paso Herald-Post reported that military police were checking trains and bus stations for the escaped German POW. The FBI had been alerted, and a $50 reward was being offered for information leading to his capture. At a second-hand store, Gaertner traded his prisoner jacket for a set of worn work clothes, denim overalls, a cotton shirt, and scuffed boots. The change transformed him into just another migrant laborer among thousands. Instead of risking exposure, by buying a bus ticket, he blended in with a group of Mexican workers waiting for farm trucks that were hiring cotton pickers. He climbed aboard with dozens of others heading north toward Las Cruces. The cotton fields outside Las Cruces provided the perfect hiding place. Farm owners didn't ask questions beyond, "Can you work?" Payment was in cash at the end of each day. No papers, no records. From sunrise to sunset, Gaertner picked cotton, earning $3 daily, more than a German worker could make in an entire week. Even in this migrant camp, America's abundance was impossible to ignore. The workers lived in tents, yet they ate better than many middle-class families back in Germany. A traveling store sold canned food, cigarettes, and ice-cold Coca-Cola. Radios and guitars were common, even among these poor transient workers. Among the Mexican laborers, Gaertner perfected his cover story. He became Peter Peterson, a Norwegian immigrant who had supposedly lost his papers in a California boarding house fire and drifted into farm work. The story sounded ordinary, and his fellow workers, many undocumented themselves, accepted it without question. After 3 months in Las Cruces, he had saved $200, enough to risk moving further west. He bought a bus ticket to Fresno, traveling at night to avoid checkpoints. By January 1946, Gaertner was in California's Central Valley, working on the Giacomazzi Ranch outside Hanford. The owner, Tony Giacomazzi, was a second-generation Italian-American whose parents had built their fortune through hard work and opportunity. He paid fair wages, provided decent housing, and never pressed his workers about their pasts. But by the summer of 1946, Peter Peterson was no longer safe. FBI wanted posters were still hanging in post offices, and Norwegian Americans were beginning to return from visiting liberated Norway. Anyone could expose him. Gaertner decided it was time for a complete reinvention. He adopted a new identity, Dennis F. Wiles, borrowing the surname from an Arkansas migrant family he had befriended. In this version of his life, Dennis was an orphan who had lost his parents at age 7 and been raised in state institutions. With no family and no ties, no one could challenge the story. Creating documents turned out to be surprisingly easy in post-war America. Within months, Dennis F. Wiles officially existed, with a birth certificate, a social security card, and even a driver's license. By the winter of 1947, Gaertner had moved to the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. At Sugar Bowl near Lake Tahoe, his alpine skiing talent brought him immediate work. Teaching wealthy Americans how to ski provided both steady income and a perfect cover. He earned $300 each month, with tips that often doubled his salary. Yet, even in this new life, the contrast with Germany haunted him. On one side of the world, he was guiding Hollywood starlets down groomed ski slopes. On the other, letters received through the Red Cross told of his family's suffering. His parents had survived their forced expulsion from Silesia, but were now living in a refugee camp outside Frankfurt. Still, Gaertner couldn't risk reaching out to his family. He convinced himself they were safer believing he had died. At Sugar Bowl, he met Mary Patterson, a passionate skier from a wealthy San Francisco family. Their romance grew as they shared runs down the snowy slopes, even while Europe struggled through the bitter winter of 1947. On January 13, 1952, Dennis Wiles went from being just another ski instructor to a brief national figure. The Southern Pacific's luxury train, City of San Francisco, was trapped by a fierce blizzard at Yuba Pass, leaving 226 passengers stranded. Gaertner, then working nearby in Northern California, joined the 3-day rescue mission. His survival skills from the Afrika Korps proved invaluable, as he helped guide civilians to safety when rescuers finally reached the train on January 16th. Life magazine covered the dramatic rescue, and one photograph showed Dennis Wiles among the rescuers. His face appeared in newspapers nationwide even as the FBI was still circulating wanted posters for him. The irony wasn't lost on Gaertner, but by then, the healthy, clean-shaven ski instructor looked nothing like the thin, weary prisoner photographed back in 1943. No one recognized him. In 1954, Gaertner moved south to warmer weather and settled in La Jolla, California. There, he turned his athletic ability toward tennis, teaching at exclusive clubs where he earned $500 a month, giving lessons to Hollywood actors and business executives. Frustrated by the limits of wooden rackets, Gaertner experimented with a new design. He created an aluminum frame racket that was lighter and stronger. He called it the Dennis racket, but he couldn't patent it without risking an investigation into his background. Years later, when René Lacoste and others commercialized similar aluminum racket designs, Gaertner could only watch as others profited from an idea he had pioneered, but could never publicly claim. At the La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club, he met Jean Clark, a widow raising 2 young children. Their relationship grew slowly, built on kindness and trust rather than passion alone. On June 15, 1964, Dennis F. Wiles married Jean Clark in Las Vegas. By this time, Gaertner had spent more years in America than in Germany, and the false history he had built felt more real than the one he left behind. Jean accepted his story, that his parents had died young, and that he had grown up in institutions with no surviving relatives. Her children began calling him Dad, never suspecting that their stepfather had once worn the uniform of Hitler's army. In 1966, the family moved to Hawaii, where Gaertner found steady work as a construction estimator on military projects. Hawaii's diverse, multicultural society was the perfect place for someone with a past to disappear. Everyone there had roots somewhere else, but by 1984, the secret weighed heavily on him. When Jean suggested taking a trip to Europe, Gaertner knew the disguise couldn't last any longer. He couldn't apply for a passport without drawing the attention of authorities. On a humid August evening, he finally confessed the truth. He was not Dennis Wiles. He was Georg Gaertner. Not an orphan with no past, but a son who had abandoned his family. Not just a ski instructor, but an escaped prisoner of war who had been living under a false name for decades. Jean's reaction moved from shock to anger, then to heartbreak. She realized that 20 years of marriage had been built on a hidden truth. In 1985, the two separated, though they stayed legally married. A formal divorce wasn't possible since Dennis Wiles could not produce the documents needed to make it official. Meanwhile, historian Arnold Kramer had written a 1979 book, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, in which he noted that 7 German POWs remained unaccounted for, including Georg Gaertner. Through intermediaries, Gaertner reached out to Kramer, offering to share his full story in exchange for negotiated terms of surrender. On September 11, 1985, exactly 40 years after his daring escape, Georg Gaertner gave himself up on live television. He appeared on NBC's Today Show, interviewed by Bryant Gumbel, as millions of Americans watched the last escaped POW finally bring his flight to an end. The government's reaction showed just how unusual his case was. The FBI quickly stated they had no interest in prosecuting a 65-year-old man for an escape that had happened 4 decades earlier. The Immigration and Naturalization Service faced an even bigger puzzle. Gaertner was not an illegal immigrant, since the U.S. had brought him here. He couldn't be deported, since the Germany of his birth no longer existed. Legal proceedings stretched on for years. Finally, in 1990, Congress passed special legislation granting him permanent resident status. But citizenship took much longer. It wasn't until November 2009 that Georg Gaertner finally became an American citizen at the age of 88, in Denver, Colorado. In his final years, Gaertner lived quietly in Loveland, Colorado. Once his legal status was clear, Jean officially divorced him. He occasionally gave interviews, often expressing deep gratitude for the generosity he had experienced in America, while also showing regret for the lifelong deception that had been necessary to survive. In 2012, he traveled back to Germany, for the first and last time visiting his sister in Hamburg. What he saw was a modern, thriving nation, unrecognizable compared to the bombed-out homeland he had fled decades earlier. Georg Gaertner passed away on January 30, 2013 in Loveland, Colorado. His death certificate carried both of his names, Georg Gaertner and Dennis F. Wiles, acknowledging the dual identity he had carried for 67 years. His story is not just about one man's escape. It highlights a deeper truth about history. Out of 425,171 Axis prisoners held in America, only 2,222 ever attempted escape, a rate of just 0.52%. That number reflects the powerful psychological effect of seeing the United States in wartime. German soldiers had been told by Nazi propaganda that America was weak, divided, and crumbling. What they actually witnessed was a country capable of waging a global war, while still maintaining prosperity at home. Prosperity that went beyond what Germans had known even before the war. The POW experience revealed a dynamic no one had expected. For many, America itself became the most convincing argument against everything they had once believed. German POWs in the United States lived under conditions far better than what most German civilians endured at home. They received 3 times the daily calories that families in Germany survived on. For many, this experience was life-changing. When the war ended, most returned home with a new perspective, unknowingly carrying democratic ideas that helped shape the Federal Republic of Germany along American lines. But for men like Georg Gaertner and Kurt Russell, a linguist who escaped from Camp Butner and lived under the name Frank Ellis for 14 years, the contrast between America and wartime Germany was too overwhelming to reconcile. The statistics behind America's handling of German POWs are striking. Out of 371,683 prisoners held in the U.S., an incredible 95% later rated their treatment as good or excellent. Only 7 prisoners were never accounted for, Gaertner being the last, following Ross Russell's surrender in 1959. No American civilians were ever killed by escaped POWs. And after 1950, about 5,000 former prisoners legally immigrated to the United States, choosing to make their lives in the very country they had once fought against. The contrast with the Soviet Union could not have been sharper. Of the 3 million German POWs taken by the USSR, roughly 1 million perished in captivity. Survivors were not released until 1955, nearly a decade after the war ended. In America, the camps became classrooms of a different kind. Prisoners were exposed to capitalism in action, seeing that prosperity could be achieved through production and innovation rather than conquest. Georg Gaertner's story captures this transformation more vividly than most. He lived 2 entirely separate lives, first as a soldier of the Afrika Korps serving a criminal regime, and later as an American citizen who embodied the immigrant pursuit of opportunity. His decision to escape was not driven by ideology, but by something deeply human, the desire for a better life. Having seen America's abundance, the thought of returning to Soviet-controlled ruins felt like walking willingly into hell. America's treatment of German POWs became one of the most powerful examples of soft power in modern history. By treating their captives with dignity and living out democratic values instead of preaching them, the U.S. managed to turn enemies into allies. Yet Gaertner's personal story also carried heavy costs. His parents went to their graves believing their son was dead. His sister mourned him for decades. His wife eventually discovered that her marriage had been built on layers of deception. Still, the man once known as Sergeant Georg Gaertner of the Afrika Korps died as Dennis F. Wiles, an American by choice and finally, by law. He had lived in the U.S. longer than in Germany, and in the end his adopted country embraced him as one of its own. His gravestone carries no dramatic account of his extraordinary journey, but his life remains a testament to the power of prosperity and freedom to transform enemies into friends. The German prisoner who had been so impressed by America's abundance that he chose never to return home had at last completed his escape. He had not only broken free from Camp Deming, he had broken free from history itself, finding a new identity in a nation wealthy enough to forget his past and generous enough to grant him a future.